Hello and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Chris Lee. I work for the Solano County Water Agency, and I also represent the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency. On behalf of all the GSAs in the subbasin, we want to welcome you all and appreciate your attendance tonight. We are recording the meeting tonight, and we'll dive into content in just a moment. And I will pass it off to our Spanish interpreter, Saul Garza, in a moment. And after we talk about interpretation, Jen Fox from Ag Innovations will provide a brief introduction. Okay, Saul, I'm gonna pass it on to you at this point.
Hola y bienvenidos a todos a esta reunión que se está llevando a cabo hoy virtualmente. Si desea escuchar el programa interpretado al español, favor de oprimir el icono de globo que dentro de poco aparecerá en la parte inferior de su dispositivo. Va a querer oprimir español. Si desea escuchar el programa solamente en español, va a querer silenciar su audio original. Gracias. Interpreters are ready for interpretation to be enabled.
Great. Thank you, Sol. And now I want to introduce myself. I'm Jen Fox, and I'm facilitating this evening. I work with Ag Innovations, a nonprofit that's leading community engagement for the Solano Subbasin. And my main role here tonight is to make sure that we get to share good information and that your questions get answered and that we end on time at 7 p.m. Pacific tonight. As a part of that, we want to pack as many of your questions and have a conversation tonight. And so community input is essential. We really appreciate you joining tonight. And with that in mind, I want to go to the next slide to share with you a couple notes about our platform this evening. First of all, as you notice, this meeting is being recorded, and that's because we want to post it on the solanogsp.com website. That site is a place where previous meetings have been recorded. We'll also share the meeting notes, and that will be there. What we want to do first, though, is show that there are some chat features. You can see that at the beginning of this meeting, we're going to use chat, and we'd like to use it for introductions. So if you turn to the next slide, you can look at that little chat bubble and press on that bubble. And we'd like to ask you to share your name. If you can type into the chat bar your name and then maybe a comma, where in the subbasin you live, work, or farm, and what brings you here tonight. So I'm going to be quiet for a moment and just invite everybody to type in the chat who you are and what brings you here tonight. Oh, great. I see Chris Rose from Solano Resource Conservation District. Welcome, Chris. Others, who else is here tonight? I want to give people a minute to introduce themselves. I see 48 of you here. So please type in the chat. Hi, John. Great to have you from Northeast Solano County. Hi, Herb. JB Bobbitt, great to have you. Everybody can open your chat and look at this so you can see other people that are in the room, a number of rural residents. Great to have you here. Yolo County RCD is in the house. Rich Collins, great to see you. Someone from Rio Vista, we're glad to have you here. Landowners, Spencer Bay, so we have some board members here. Really want to thank everyone who's attending. It looks like folks from around the Solano Subbasin, Solano County Environmental Health. I invite you, if you haven't introduced yourself, please do. There's 48 folks with us on this call, and we are so glad that you are here. What I want to do right now is forward to the next slide. While we still have a few people introducing themselves, that's great. I want to make sure that everybody has a sense of what we have, the reason that we're gathering this evening and what today's meeting, the objectives of today's meeting. This meeting was, the origin of this meeting is it's one of a number of virtual town halls that we've held since the development of the Solano Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan. That plan came to be following the 2014 Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, which told everybody throughout California to work on it. You can see in the chat, the last link right there has a link to that groundwater sustainability plan. And we invite you to, if you haven't seen that, that really is something that we've been holding these meetings talking about these. And if we go to the next slide, you can see that we've put together an agenda which we will talk about the state of the Solano Subbasin. We want to make sure we share some recent what we've been finding on the groundwater efforts. And we're going to have a dedicated discussion. The first half of the meeting will focus on the water, and we know that groundwater and surface water are linked. We'll be talking about the hydrology. Then about halfway through the meeting, we'll turn to related efforts because we expect a lot of you have questions on irrigation. And we'll be hearing about the Irrigated Lands Program, and we'll also have a second opportunity to talk about your questions and to have a panel discussion. So those are the two main parts of tonight's meeting. And I want to, before I turn it over to Chris Lee to give us an overview of the links between groundwater and surface water conditions in the subbasin, I'd like to launch a poll. So Lupe, would you mind launching question 1? This question, you can read it. In English and Spanish, it asks, how many of these Solano Subbasin town halls have you attended? Really want to hear, some people may have been to a lot of them, some people maybe not at all. I'm seeing, great, I'm seeing about half of the room answering. If you haven't yet answered, we'll hold it open for another minute or two. We're hoping to hear, is this topic, the topics we're going to be discussing tonight, new or not to you? I'll leave this open for another minute. And I'm going to share the results of this poll. You can see it on your screen. Hopefully I'll summarize in case you're on a phone. It looks like for about a quarter of the room, this is your first town hall. So welcome. We're really excited to share information and hear your questions. For those of you who have attended 2 or more town halls, thanks for coming back. I expect you'll have questions too, and I hope that we can have something for everybody tonight. I'll go ahead and ask, we have a couple more questions. I want to ask Lupe to launch the next question. And that question, as you can read, asks you how you heard about the event. So go ahead and answer this question. If you don't see a particular way, I'd invite you, and you're typing, you're choosing the other answer. I would love if you can just type in the chat, specifically, how did you hear about the event? Was it something online? If you're choosing the other choice, please let us know in the chat how you heard about the event. Great, we'll give folks a minute to answer this poll. We want to make sure we know the right ways to reach out with you and to continue communication. Great, good. So I hear somebody heard about it from the Vacaville Reporter. I'm going to end the poll and share these results. Folks can see, wow, more than half of you heard about it in the Solano GSP newsletter. And we will be, during this meeting, sharing a way to sign up. You can go on to solanogsp.com and sign up if you don't get that. Those of you who heard about it through Facebook or other methods, that's great. And I also appreciate a few other ways in the chat, word of mouth. Great to hear that, or emails, etc. So great to hear that the word did get out about this meeting. And no matter how you heard about it, we're glad to have you here. 2 more questions. The next one can be quick. We want to go ahead and launch a poll that asks you if you have seen the groundwater sustainability plan that I just mentioned, or in April, we also came out with an annual report, which describes, it's a required piece by the Department of Water Resources, and it has some really nitty-gritty hydrology. I invite folks to answer that poll, and I'll share the results with everybody here as soon as we get a good group of folks finishing that. What I'm noticing about the answers is they're fairly evenly split. I'll give folks 1 more minute, but I'll mention that almost half of you have read and commented on the GSP. I'm going to end this poll and share the results. That's great. It sounds like a lot of people here are familiar with the groundwater sustainability plan. And it sounds like somebody's not able to see the question. Want to mention to folks that you're welcome. If you're having any technical issues, you can chat with Guadalupe Garcia, and she can help you with those. I'm also, as you guys can see, it looks like about a fifth of the folks in the room have read parts of the groundwater sustainability or the annual plan, and a good quarter of the room has not seen the groundwater sustainability plan, but has heard of it. And then we do have about 13% or so that didn't know about it. So really appreciate folks answering that question. We're gonna go ahead and we have one last poll question that invites you to fill in an answer. While you're thinking about that, I just want to make sure and highlight for our presenters today, and also for all of you that are asking questions. While it looks like more than half of you are really familiar with this topic, I want to acknowledge that about a third of the room is less familiar. So just want to make sure that in today's presentation, we'll try to avoid using acronyms, etc. So it looks like this last question, I'll just ask it for you. And you could feel free to type in the chat. The question for you is, if you are a landowner in the Solano Subbasin, are you adjusting your practices this year given the wet winter? And if so, we invite you to, I'd love it if you can do it in the poll, but if you're not able to read the poll itself, please feel free to type it in the chat. We're just interested to hear, we're all in the context of a very exceptional year here in California, and we're interested to hear your thoughts on that. All right. Well, we have a lot of information to get to. I'm going to go ahead and if you didn't get a chance to type it in, I'm going to just share a little bit about what we saw. Basically, we've been seeing that there's a lot of folks who are new to this kind of an event. Again, welcome. We're really glad to have you here. And we also have seen that there's folks from all around the subbasin. So I want to just thank you all for introducing yourself and taking the time today. I also want to mention that what we're going to do right now is close the chat, because we're going to end up later in this meeting. We are going to have a question answer session that will allow us to group questions and make sure that we're able to answer as many questions as possible. So wanted to let folks know that from here forward, if you use the chat, you'll be able to reach Guadalupe Garcia, who is going to be able to help you with any technical questions. Again, quick reminder that there is a Spanish channel, so anybody who joined late and has not joined that, Lupe can help you with that. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Lee, who's going to talk about why we're here talking about groundwater. And for the folks who it's your very first time attending a virtual town hall, we'll give you some background on what's been done and who are the groundwater sustainability agencies leading this effort. And then we'll learn a little bit about the hydrology. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Jen, and good evening again. And apologies for those that have already heard my name, but I'm going to say it again if you didn't come on right when I was giving some introductory remarks. My name is Chris Lee, work for the Solano County Water Agency, and I also represent the Solano Groundwater Sustainability Agency. As Jen said, we want to give you a little background on a reminder of some of the challenges we have before us. We're going to talk a little bit about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Solano Subbasin. And as Jen said, we're going to try to stay away from the acronyms as best as we can. I do apologize to some of us that have been working in this for a while now. It just kind of slips off the tongue. So I'm going to give you a few right up front, and hopefully I'll be able to say them all out. So you're going to be hearing me say Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, or SGMA. You're also going to be hearing me say GSA, or Groundwater Sustainability Agency, and GSP, or Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And I promise I'm going to try very hard to say them all out loud. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so up until the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act became effective in January of 2015, all previous groundwater legislation was purely voluntary. What the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act required was that a GSA, or a Groundwater Sustainability Agency, or multiple GSAs in our case, create a groundwater sustainability plan to manage local groundwater subbasins. And we're talking about the Solano Subbasin, as you can see on the map here. And we are required by law to do this. If we don't do it, the state can, will, and step in and take over management of the subbasin. As you can see on the map, the Solano Subbasin includes the entire eastern portion of Solano County. It also goes a little bit into Sacramento County, and then a tiny little sliver into Yolo County as well. And then you can also see on the map boundaries of the various GSAs. The Solano GSA, which I represent, is in the magenta, kind of the larger portion on the map. Next slide, please. So this is a long-term process. Fortunately, we've made it through the first couple of hurdles. We've formed the groundwater sustainability agencies. We've submitted our groundwater sustainability plan to DWR January 31st, 2022. And now we're kind of waiting. DWR has up to 2 years to review our groundwater sustainability plan. They've reviewed a number of the critically overdrafted basins, and they're starting to review some of the high priority and medium priority groundwater basins. So hopefully we'll be up fairly soon in the queue. But what we have before us now is that we're in implementation mode for the groundwater sustainability plan, is really to show the state over the next 20 years that we are managing our groundwater in a sustainable manner. And as you'll hear from Nick Watterson later, we're kind of getting there already. And we also have to make sure that we maintain funding to continue with all the monitoring and reporting and managing of the subbasin, essentially in perpetuity. Next slide, please. So when we first started talking about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we're going on about 7 years now. We wanted to see if we could create really a single groundwater sustainability agency to manage the subbasin. It didn't quite end up that way, but it's all worked out. You know, we've been working together collaboratively the entire time. What we ended up with were 5 separate GSAs. We have the City of Vacaville GSA, the Sacramento County GSA, the Solano Irrigation District GSA, the Northern Delta GSA, and the Solano GSA, which I represent, which is a JPA made up of a number of different agencies, including the cities of Rio Vista and Dixon, Solano County Supervisory Districts 4 and 5, the Dixon and Solano Resource Conservation Districts, Cal Water Dixon, Solano Farm Bureau, Main Prairie Water District, Reclamation District 2068, and a member of the Solano County Ag Advisory Committee. I think more than half of the board members for the Solano GSA are either growers or ranchers, so it's really good to get them representing you good folks at that board. And we, again, as I mentioned earlier, we've been working together collaboratively now and implementing the GSP. And I also want to give a lot of credit to the consultants that have helped us along the way. And you're going to be hearing from a few more of them tonight. You've already heard from Jen and her team at Ag Innovations. They've been doing a fantastic job with outreach and education and facilitating meetings like what we're having tonight. And then we'll be hearing from Nick Watterson from Ludorf and Scalmini, and potentially Vicky on some of the panels. Ludorf and Scalmini has done just an amazing job with a number of other consultants helping out as well, but just putting the plan together and helping us implement it. So I just really want to say thank you to all the good work that they've been doing behind the scenes. Next slide, please. So there's quite a bit that we are required to do by the state to implement the GSP, the Groundwater Sustainability Plan. And as Jen mentioned earlier, we have to submit our annual reports by April 1st of each year. And so we've submitted our second annual report. And then we have to do a fairly comprehensive update every 5 years to the plan as conditions change, as things, new laws or new implementation or new interpretations, we have to make changes to our plan. All along the way, we have to monitor groundwater conditions, groundwater levels, groundwater quality, things like subsidence to make sure we are not hitting any of the undesirable results, which could cause corrective actions. And then we're doing a lot of outreach and education along the way as well, along with meetings like we have tonight, as Jen mentioned, through the Groundwater Sustainability Plan and the newsletters. We're trying to touch base with as many stakeholders as possible to let them know about upcoming meetings, what's going on with the Groundwater Sustainability Plan, and that's what you'll hear a little bit here later from Nick and others. We also look at grant opportunities and what we can do to potentially offset some of the implementation costs. And I'll touch a little bit more on grants as we get further into the presentation. Next slide, please. So even though we're in pretty good shape as far as groundwater conditions for our subbasin, conditions can change and they will change over time. And we have seen that through many drought and wet cycles over the last several decades. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Nick Watterson at Ludorf and Scalmini, who's going to give you kind of a more in-depth look at current conditions of the subbasin. Thank you, Nick.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. Again, my name is Nick Watterson. I'm a principal hydrogeologist with Bludorf and Scalmanini Consulting Engineers, and we've been working with a team of other consultants, on developing the groundwater sustainability plan, and then continuing to support the GSAs in the subbasin on implementing and reporting on that plan. I think, yeah, as Chris just noted, I'm just going to provide a brief overview of some of the conditions and notable conditions in the subbasin. As Jen mentioned, and I think Chris as well, that we just recently completed the annual report for water year 2022. So that takes us up through that water year extends through October or through the end of September of 2022. So we're going to touch on some of the conditions that exist over, as a result of that water year, and then also a brief preview of what we're seeing in spring groundwater conditions that are, as a result of some of the wet precipitation that we had this last year. So why don't we go to the next slide here? So just a quick overview, and in the Solano Subbasin, there's 3 primary sources of water supply. Generally at a very general scale, it includes surface water primarily from the Delta, and then also surface water through the Solano project stored in Lake Berryessa, and then the third source being groundwater pumping supplies. In 2022, we saw about 2/3 of the supply being met by surface water, with about 1/3 from groundwater, and that's pretty much consistent with the historical average. It is a little bit. There was a little bit more groundwater utilization this in the year water year 2022, but I mean, as Chris noted, things go up and down on an annual basis, and it's generally in line with historical usage. So I go to the next slide, please. This slide just shows some of the trends in water storage within the subbasin, specifically within Lake Berryessa, where the water is stored for the Solano project, and then also some of the changes in storage that are in the groundwater system. The upper line here showing Lake Berryessa storage and those annual storage as of April 1 of each year. You can see that the total capacity is roughly about 1.6 million acre feet in Lake Berryessa. And if you can think about that as roughly with the Solano Subbasin being roughly 350,000 acres, that's equivalent to maybe roughly, a little over 4 feet of water spread across the entire subbasin. So considerable capacity, storage capacity in that reservoir. And as with climatic variability, we do see that storage going up and down, and then notable low levels during the drought of 2014 through 16, and then also more recently in 2021 and 22. Notably, we have seen those levels rebound considerably as a result of this last winter. So as of April 1. It's back up at almost 1.4 million acre feet, which represents, I think, about an increase in storage of about 400,000 acre feet since last spring, and I think an increase of about 600,000 acre feet over the low in October of 2022. So a lot of water has accrued there in Lake Berryessa. And I think the 1.4 represents, it's above average for this time of year, and is roughly 89% or so of total capacity. So a good thing, recognizing the importance of that surface water supply to the subbasin. The lower line here is our cumulative change in groundwater storage over the period since 1991 through water year 2022, and you can see those the variability in that storage is much less than what we see in the surface water reservoir. But those periods where you see the slope increasing, those are periods where we're gaining storage in the groundwater system, and then those negative slopes are periods where we are losing storage. So that's just part of the natural cycle that we would expect to occur. It is notable that over the entire period since 1991 through 2022, there's actually been an overall, we estimate that there's been an increase in total groundwater storage. But since over the last 20 years, there have been some general declines in some areas that we continue to keep a close eye on. Next slide, please. This chart shows groundwater pumping over the period 1991 through 2022. On average, the groundwater pumping over this period is somewhere around 185,000 acre feet per year. In 2022, it was a little bit higher, at totaling 225,000 acre feet. Again, this is just in response to very dry conditions that existed during that water year, and then also followed several consecutive dry years prior to that. So I think that the important thing to keep in mind here is that we do anticipate that groundwater pumping will go up and down by a year. Sometimes it's going to be greater than others, but over the long term, we're looking to sustain a level that balances those periods where it needs to be groundwater needs to be utilized at a greater level, with periods where we can try to and allow the groundwater system to recover and through additional groundwater recharge. So it's just part of the game we play here, and just sort of tracking that, and it's important to build that buffer during wet years so that it's there during those drier periods. Next slide, please. And so water levels are not the only thing of interest and of importance. This slide here is just showing some groundwater quality considerations in the subbasin, as well as land subsidence. While the groundwater sustainability plan does have metrics and tracking of conditions related to groundwater quality, it is important to recognize that the plan itself is not intended to remediate pre-existing groundwater quality impaired areas, but primarily with the interest of ensuring that that management actions or other actions under the groundwater sustainability plan don't exacerbate existing groundwater quality issues. So this map here on the left is nitrate concentrations. So those nitrate is a common constituent in groundwater. It can come from numerous sources, including from septic or other sewage wastewater disposal, but also from fertilizer applications. And the drinking water level, regulatory for drinking water level for water that's served for public consumption is 10. And so this is just showing some of those concentrations, some areas where it's notably higher. And again, this is part of what the GSP is tracking, but also keeping in mind that there are limitations to what the GSP is responsible for. I think Kelly Huff or Martha McKean are going to speak in a little bit, maybe touch briefly on some of the other efforts that are going on in some of the other programs, including irrigated lands regulatory programs, but there's also many other programs under the Regional Water Quality Control Board that oversee the water quality issues. On land subsidence, this map here shows land subsidence over the water year period. It's most notable that these numbers here showing vertical displacement negative, meaning that the land surface is going down, but these are values that are very, very small. The maximum value that we're seeing here over this particular period is well less than half an inch. And so it's some of this is just the natural elasticity of the land surface to to the natural draining or filling of the groundwater reservoir, and it's just but generally the land subsidence is not an issue of concern in the subbasin, but we do track it and continue to keep tabs on it. Next slide, please. So that as I think both Jen and Chris alluded to, there's a lot of activities going on that are going on collaboratively with multiple entities, both the GSAs as well as other collaborators. These are some of the three key areas of emphasis where the collaborative and the GSAs are working. One is to enhance the monitoring occurring in the subbasin. So during the development of the groundwater sustainability plan, and since that time, there are a number of data gap areas where there's a need to and an interest in learning more about or identifying additional monitoring. So that's part of the GSA's effort, the different GSA's efforts to enhance that monitoring, both spatially but also temporally, doing some automated, enhanced automated monitoring where we can then track things at a higher frequency, and then certainly conducting outreach to the stakeholders in the basin to keep folks informed on groundwater conditions and the various activities that are occurring related to water management. Things that certainly include this virtual town hall as well as the newsletters and other outreach efforts. So that's those are efforts occurring and will continue to occur. There's been the GSAs continue to explore funding opportunities through grants or otherwise to support the efforts to implement the groundwater sustainability plan, but also generally just to support the sustainable management of the water resources in the basin. And then a third key area being that there's a great interest in planning multi-benefit projects that will enhance recharge and other water supplies. One of the key areas of interest there is to figure out ways where the subbasin can harness stormwater flows in such a manner that it can enhance the groundwater supplies, but also mitigate some flooding or other drainage issues that are occurring. So identify those some opportunities to help on a number of different levels, and then most importantly, just again, just develop the resiliency of the basin to be able to buffer future dry periods. Next slide, please. So this is we want to give a quick update on water levels. So while generally overall the groundwater basin has been in good condition and we believe is sustainable, there are some areas of noted local groundwater level declines in the groundwater sustainability plan. We identified this northwest focus area shown in purple on this map as an area where it had seen some local declines over the last 20 or so years. These hydrographs and these dots shown here are representative monitoring sites that are included in the groundwater sustainability plan. Each of these is symbolized by the change in water level that has occurred between spring of 2022 and spring of 2023. And so we're just relating it back to spring conditions. We know that seasonally things go up and down from spring to fall. And so we're just really primarily at this point interested in comparing 23 to 2022. And then it remains to be seen, what we see in the fall of 2023, where we expect that we'll see both not only the influence of enhanced recharge that occurred because of the wet precipitation, but also potentially the benefits of decreased demand because of the soil moisture and potentially delayed demands because of the late precipitation that did occur here. So generally in these wells, we're seeing levels that have changed. I think in every one of these that has changed in a positive direction from spring of 2022 to 2023, meaning water levels have come up, and those range. But you can see on the map here the darker blue squares being where it's come up greater than 10 feet, and then those aquas squares being where it's somewhere between 5 and 10, and then the green being somewhere between 0 and 5. So generally, we're seeing that responsiveness in the shallower part of the groundwater system, as is evidenced in these graphs. And we'll look forward to seeing what those conditions look like over the next irrigation season and into the fall as well. Next slide, please. So in addition to all those broader efforts that we've got going on in the subbasin, it really is a lot of focus on this northwestern part of the subbasin, where we've seen some modest groundwater level declines. The important thing is to just keep on, make sure that we're tracking that and really identifying some opportunities now that we can get going before just to make sure that whatever is occurring there doesn't become a longer term chronic condition. So again, it's a lot of focus on multi-benefit projects, holding water on the landscape through all sorts of different mechanisms, and we're really hoping to gear up efforts to coordinate with stakeholders, with landowners that are interested in working, and other water managers that are interested in working on implementing solutions and to achieve some of these objectives. So with the focus of that interest being in that northwest focus area to prop up those water levels and mitigate some of the down gradient stormwater issues that are also occurring. Next slide. I think that's everything that I've got on the groundwater conditions and the state of the subbasin there. So wow. I'll turn it back to you, Jen.
Thanks. And thanks for that. And I want to just appreciate that this was a lot of information. But again, a lot of you are somewhat familiar with this. We've already started to see some questions coming into the question answer box. So what I'm showing right now is just a reminder. From this point forward, we're using the question answer so that we can get as many of your questions into the room as possible. So I see 6 folks have already typed in some questions and answers, and I'm going to invite right now, just want to have you all take a look at this slide. If you're on a computer, there's an arrow to where that question answer button is. If you're on a phone, you'll press *9. Now we're going to turn to a chance to discuss questions and answers, in particular about the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and about the hydrology. Just want to mention, Nick even previewed it. We're going to talk about a lot of other efforts, and I think people probably have even broader questions, but I'd like to spend the next 5 minutes or so on a few good questions that have already come in. So I invite Lupe or Susanna, if you wouldn't mind changing us to gallery mode. You'll see the speakers and also Nick's colleague, Vicky, who are from the LSCE. And I'm going to jump in with a few questions. So I think these first 2 questions that I see here are for you, Nick. John asks, what percentage of the groundwater storage is from Lake Berryessa versus the Delta? And Susanna, maybe before you take off the screen, if you wouldn't mind going back, I think that we have a really nice visual there in slide 15. So I'll have you keep this up just for a minute while Nick, I invite you to answer it a little more clearly, but you can see this is the 2022, the water year 2022 data, and you can see that. Nick, do you want to add anything related to John's question?
Well, I guess if I'm understanding it, maybe I'm not sure if it's referring to surface water that's coming from the Delta versus Berryessa, so I'm gonna, if it's incorrect in interpreting that way, but I will say that generally speaking, that in terms of surface water, it's about 60% of the surface water is from the Delta and about 40% is from Lake Berryessa on average. And so that's you know and then with that, the entirety of that being representing roughly about 70% of the total water used in the subbasin.
Great, thanks. And while we have the slides up, in a moment, I'll open it up and there's some broader questions. But while we're here, if we go to the next slide, Herb asked a particular question on the trends in water storage slide and wanted to understand how groundwater was determined and asks covering what geographical area.
Yeah, so this is it. So one of the things that it's a very good question. In this particular slide, there are multiple ways that we estimate the changes in groundwater storage, and one way is that we have a groundwater model that we have constructed to best represent the conditions in the subbasin. And so with that model, we look at and we account for all the inflows that are coming into the subbasin, all the outflows that are leaving the subbasin, and then ultimately calculating what that translates into changes in groundwater storage. We also look at water levels in wells, and so we take water levels in wells and we will do what we call contouring of those. So we essentially generate a representation of what the water table looks like, and then we compare that over time. So this particular slide here these are simulated conditions for the water year, and so, but it is, one of the things that is challenging is that when it comes to groundwater utilization, much of it is estimated. There are meters on wells for the urban areas, but we oftentimes by and large don't have any metered information on groundwater pumping for other wells, including domestic wells or irrigation wells. So there are estimations that are involved in that, using our best available information and science.
Great, thanks. And why don't we let the slides go and just move it back to gallery view for a couple more questions. We'll take off the slides, and I want to open it up. Nick, there's one more kind of hydrology question in the queue for you. Actually, two more. One is, how long does it take for water from a wet year to recharge the subbasin? Wow, that's a hard question, but you're the right person to answer it.
Well, I get, not to just say it depends, but certainly your location, both the vertically where we're talking about in the groundwater system. So there are two different primary aquifers in the subbasin. One is very, very deep and takes a long time to recharge, and then the other is where most of the groundwater utilization comes from, is shallower. So that receives we'll see the influences of that earlier on, but also your proximity to surface waterways is very important. And so those surface water bodies are a source of recharge to the groundwater system. And so your proximity to those can certainly affect that. But it's in wells that are very close to major waterways, we can see almost instantaneous responses in some cases. But again, generally the deeper you go, the farther you are from some of those bigger surface water bodies, generally the more muted the response becomes, so that that's, I don't know, it's hard. I guess it's hard to, it really just does depend, but
Yeah, great. Thanks for really trying to capture this hydrology for us. I'm going to turn to maybe a question that's a little bit easy to answer, but still a bit of a black box. Chris Lee, this one's coming to you. Ronald asks, has there been any indication from the DWR actions on other areas, whether on other areas, groundwater sustainability plans, whether Solano's plan will be acceptable? Chris, maybe you want to start on that one, and Nick and Vicki, I know you also have some broad experience here.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a good question. And yeah, we're waiting. But no, I think we're in good shape. Looking at what DWR has responded in some of the plans that they've already reviewed, I think that we have a very comprehensive plan, and we've looked at it in depth, and I think we're in good shape. I mean, the good news is that our great team here has worked on another plan or two that's already been accepted. So we have a very similar model. Again, each subbasin is different depending on the hydrology and what's going on locally, but the basic structure that we have in place, I think, is starting us off in a very good foot. And I don't know, Vicki, if you want to kind of weigh in on that, what you've seen from some of the other plans, but I think we're headed in the right direction for sure.
I think you've covered it well, and we've tried to identify things according to the GSP regulations, other information that came about first, and the department's evaluation of the critically overdrafted plans, things that are really important to explain well in terms of the sustainable management criteria and all the tracking and monitoring and data gaps to still be filled in the future. So we'll cross our fingers.
Thanks. Great. Well, I really appreciate that. And I feel like there are a few more hydrology, very specific hydrology questions, but I also want to make sure we get time to talk about other efforts in the subbasin. So what I'm going to suggest now is folks can keep typing in your questions. I'm also going to invite, there are a few very technical questions like depths for groundwater recharge that I would invite Nick and Vicki, if you want to answer any of those very nitty-gritty questions, feel free to type in some answers. In the meantime, I'm going to invite Justin Cole and Misty Callwriter, Martha and Carrie to get ready to speak. And Susanna, I'll ask you to bring back the slides so that we can transition. We're happy to keep talking hydrology, but we also have a sense from the early interest in this that there's folks with a lot of interest about related efforts in the subbasin. So that's what we're going to turn to. Please feel free to keep typing in questions. We will come back for even a broader panel discussion. But what we want to do right now is just recognize that you've heard from three of the many folks, GS, Groundwater Sustainability Agency boards, folks at different water agencies, folks at RCDs, folks at farm bureaus, that all are related to the efforts in the Solano Subbasin, along with all of you as residents and farmers and growers. And so I'm going to first turn it over to Martha McKean from the Dixon Resource Conservation District to tell us a little bit about their work on the irrigated lands program. I also want to honor that, also on this call, we have Chris Rose. This is RCD's work on a lot of efforts. We've invited Dixon to share a little bit more about the irrigated lands program. Martha, over to you.
Great, thank you, Jen. Hi, I'm Martha McKean, and I work for Dixon Resource Conservation District. So the Dixon and Solano Resource Conservation Districts, we assist growers, and we do that with the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. The Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program mitigates fertilizers, pesticides, sediment, other materials from fields during irrigating and storm events. So that is a water quality program. And so if you'd like to learn more about that, please visit our website or scan our QR code. Thank you.
Great. Martha, that's fantastic. And thanks for putting up this QR code. We'll leave this slide up for just a moment. Really want to appreciate Dixon RCD as a partner in all of this. And we're going to bring Martha back for the Q&A too. But want to hear from a few other of the many folks that are working. And so I'll turn it over to Misty Kaltreiter, who is from Solano County and is going to tell us about the One Water framework, which is I think a lot of folks on this call will be interested, and I'll let Misty say more.
Thank you, Jen. Good evening, everybody. Misty Kaltreiter from Solano County, and I wanted to briefly highlight this recent work from Solano County is doing to develop what is called as a One Water management framework. And through this work, we're bringing together entities throughout the county to coordinate on how we're looking at water management. And you kind of heard a little bit of highlight of something that Nick has mentioned. This is something that we're kind of working on. And as an integrative approach across various water sectors to develop a One Water framework for the unincorporated entire county. And so over the next year and a half, the Solano County staff and consultant team will be collaborating with agencies and municipalities throughout the county to develop the One Water framework to advance practical and nature-based solutions to various water challenges that are facing the county. So feel free to email us and we can provide more information as it becomes available. Thank you. Jen, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Missy, and we'll be pulling you back. I can tell some folks are going to have some questions on this. Carrie Keaton is on the call, and we're going to just invite him. Carrie, I hope you can come off mute and share a little bit about Solano Irrigation District and all of the work that you're doing around groundwater and more.
Sure, thank you. What we're doing is pretty straightforward this year for groundwater in the Solano Subbasin. Normally, like last year, for example, which was a drought year, we used about 10,000 acre feet in the Solano Subbasin of water for ag purposes. And normally our target is between 8 and 10,000 acre feet. This year, we're reducing that to about 2,000 acre feet. We just have so much surface water that we don't need to pay the high cost of pumping. So we're not going to do it. We're still going to use a couple thousand acre feet. That's pretty much a baseline for us because we have some customers on the extreme ends of our system that we can only get groundwater to them. So that's why we have that as a base. So that's our ag side of our business. Also, in the northwest focused area of the Solano Subbasin, and then in the very northwest corner over by Lake Solano, we have which is still in the Solano Subbasin, we have a public water system, and that public water system has been on the decline for many years. We drilled in 94 and came online and started serving customers in 97. And since 97, the depth to groundwater has been increasing constantly. So we've been very concerned because we have an obligation to serve those customers. That's their only water supply. It's about 37 customers in that area. We actually applied for and got an EPA STAG grant for $2.8 million to drill a second well to help support and sustain that water system. And so we just hired engineering firm, I don't know if anybody's heard of them, but LSCE out of Woodland, to help lead the effort in the design, permitting, and construction of second groundwater well, and then connection back to that system. So hopefully we have an adequate supply that helps out those residents. And then with respect to groundwater, that's about it for us right now. Thank you.
Carrie, thanks so much. There's so much work that Solano Irrigation District is doing. I appreciate you giving us a quick summary. And we're going to pass it over to a colleague just to remind folks, Solano Irrigation District and the City of Vacaville are both groundwater sustainability agencies, as Chris Lee described at the beginning of the call. So I'd like to turn it over to Justin Cole, Director of Utilities at the City of Vacaville, to tell us a little bit about the GSA related activities in the City of Vacaville.
Oh, thank you, Jen. Again, Justin Colt, the City of Vacaville Utilities Department, here representing the Vacaville GSA. The City of Vacaville has a recycled water program that we've developed since we completed our tertiary wastewater treatment plant in 2015. Tertiary treated recycled water really meets the California Code of Regulations, Title 22, so that we can repurpose that water. And currently it's being discharged into Old Alamo Creek and makes its way to the Delta. Some of the goals of repurposing the water for us is to diversify the city's water portfolio. We are unique in Solano County in that we get water from the state water project, the Solano Water Project, and groundwater. So using recycled water could offset some of our groundwater pumping. We could, we're also looking to maximize our return on the investment that we made into our treatment facility here at Easterly to kind of keep our costs down. Some of the recycled water uses that we are exploring is downstream diversions. There is industrial reuse. It's for boilers and chillers and processed water. There's obviously the agricultural uses, urban irrigation, which is probably the most popular one, which you use to water the landscape medians, parks, and potentially homes, front yards. There's some of the uses that are a little bit further out, more treatment and more technologies needed and maybe more public buy-in. And that's like the indirect potable reuse, directing it or injecting it into groundwater wells, direct potable reuse. And there is the potential for environmental habitat or in-stream augmentations. So at this point, we are at the preliminary planning phase. We got some grant money to continue the program to kind of look at all of these different options and what makes sense for the city of Vacaville and do a kind of a preliminary screening, limit, narrow down our options and come up with a recommended kind of recycled water portfolio, which will determine the scope and size of our project.
Justin, thanks so much. And I hope you'll stay on. We are going to want to bring you back in the panel. I encourage folks, if you have any questions on anything the speakers just brought up, to type those into the question answer, and we'll come back to them in a panel. But before we go to that panel, I'm already noticing there are some questions a little bit about, okay, we're talking about all of this ambitious work, water recycling, well monitoring, et cetera. How is all of this work being funded? And so I'm going to invite Chris Lee to turn on your camera and maybe give us an overview of that. Chris Lee, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Jen. Or maybe if we can, there we go. Okay, so as has been asked and as Jen just talked about, each of the GSAs have been required to pay their share. Unfortunately, when the state put the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act out and it became law, there wasn't any funding early on. There's some grant funding now available, and I'll talk about that here shortly. But essentially, the state said the local agencies have to take that burden on. Fortunately, all of our other GSAs have existing funding mechanisms in place to pay their share. In order to pay our share, the Solano GSA developed a charge study, which informed a Proposition 218 process last year. And so the Solano GSA did a rate study, and landowners within the GSA are now paying this flat rate charge for GSP implementation and Sigma compliance. This charge will last for 5 years, and we will likely be revisiting that with potentially some type of different mechanism in the future as we look at some different options that are out there. Next slide, please. So fortunately, as been mentioned by a few of the other panelists, we have been preliminary awarded a grant from the Department of Water Resources through Proposition 668. It's not final yet, but we're looking to get somewhere in the order of about $4.4 million towards GSP implementation costs, which probably very likely will help decrease some of our local costs, because we put a lot of actions in there that will be required for monitoring, for updates, the 5-year updates, and there's some potential funding in there for some of these pilot projects that you heard about earlier, at looking at some potential recharge or some different land use applications that landowners can do that may help with recharge possibilities as well. Once we get that final award and get an agreement in hand with DWR, we're going to take a very hard look to see if it does make sense to lower those current charges that we are applying for landowners within the Solano GSA. Another effort, and this is a slightly different effort than what you heard from Misty on One Water, but we're also working with Solano County looking at well inventories and seeing if there are other alternatives we can look at beyond just a flat rate charge to see if that makes sense from a landowner perspective as well. So we're going to be exploring different opportunities, different alternatives to look at, again, trying to reduce the local cost share as much as we can. Unfortunately, again, the state didn't provide a whole lot of funding up front. Now there are some grant opportunities and we're availing of those as best we can. Again, we have a preliminary award in hand. Once we get a final award, we'll be sharing that information with all the stakeholders, and again, taking a real hard look to see if that can help defray some of the local costs. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Chris. So when we go to the next slide, just a reminder here on this next slide that we're going to continue with some question answers. And I see we have a number of open questions. And so I'm going to hold this slide up for a moment, but then I'm going to invite us to go onto gallery view, and I'll moderate a discussion. So if we can, let's go ahead. I want to encourage everybody to type in any of your questions into the chat. And I'm going to just start by asking some questions of the panelists. And just a reminder, we've got a number of panelists here who represent a small number of the people working on this effort. But Chris, since we were just talking about funds, I'd like to bring up, there's probably 5 or 6 questions here related to funds. So let me first mention one that I think you just answered. There was a question: are there any funds or grants being researched to exclude any and all property owner fees? So just want to, Chris, I think you answered the very first part of that question, and I want to take a moment to just congratulate the Solano Subbasin. As Chris mentioned, the DWR grant, there's a preliminary finding that the Solano Subbasin should receive significant monies. The Solano Subbasin can't count on that yet, but that is huge, and it is funds, and there was a long-term grant effort put in. Chris, you might want to say something about that, and I think related to that, the questioner asked about that excluding any and all property owner fees. And also, I think the same questioner asked, how are we being charged the fees? So maybe you could address that.
Sure. Yeah. So again, once we get the final award from DWR and a grant agreement in place, we're going to take a very hard look at the flat rate charge we currently have for the Solano GSA. And now remember, this is across all of the different GSAs, which we showed a map of earlier. So all of the GSAs contribute to GSP implementation actions, and that includes that whole suite of things that you've heard about earlier about groundwater level monitoring and reporting and these large 5-year updates. And a lot of what we asked for, and again, we're hoping we're get all of the funding we asked for, goes to exactly those types of activities. So we can start looking at reducing some of the flat rate charges we have for the Solano GSA and defray some of the costs that some of the other GSAs are contributing to as well. So I'll just briefly touch on that flat rate charge. So that was part of the other question, Jen. And so we did a study last year looking at ways to see how we could raise money to implement this GSP. Again, the state didn't provide anything. The local agencies didn't have funding set aside for managing groundwater. So this is how we kind of looked at things. It's not perfect. We understand that landowners get a levy of charges coming their way every year from the state and from the local agencies. And we've tried to reduce that as much as we can and look at things very critically and there's a question about forecasting. We have looked out over the next 5 years and what all those costs would come up to. And that's kind of how we got to that rate charge.
Thanks, Chris. I think you answered a couple questions in there, and really appreciate you answering those. I am going to just include a few more questions on fees. Richard asks, please give us a profile of water users you are hoping to have finance your efforts. And I think Kathy asked a similar question. I think you answered that a little bit, but maybe you want to say, do you want to say anything else about that in particular?
Sure. So for the Solano GSA, we are levying a flat rate charge for all landowners within the geographical boundaries of the Solano GSA. So it's a flat rate per acre owned by each landowner.
Great, thanks for that clear answer there. So a related question is, somebody first writes a comment that says domestic well users shouldn't be paying for any of this. Are you going to reimburse us for all of our well costs and maintenance? Yeah, do you want, can you just answer that question about reimbursement?
We're not contemplating that at this time, but that's something, if there's additional grant funding in the future, that may be a possibility, but it's not something that we're looking into right now, reimbursing individual landowners for any wells they've drilled or any maintenance. So
okay, thanks. Good. I'm going to turn to our next question. This one might come to you, Misty. I recognize that this probably isn't a huge part of the One Water effort, but maybe you can start us, and Chris and Justin could weigh in as well. This question is there any effort underway to reduce building growth in the Vacaville and Solano Subbasin area? I want to recognize that this is not in the GSA charge, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency charge, but I think perhaps any of the panelists might offer any thoughts based on where you sit in Solano County or as a city.
I think Justin may be able to answer the Vacaville question. For Solano County alone, essentially we have a very robust general plan that really puts forward and encourages ag and encourages only growth in the cities and the urban areas, and so our general plan moving forward, we want, as part of the One Water, we want to look at multi-benefit projects for management actions to support the general plan moving forward. So, and essentially that's to encourage more in ag encouragement. So I don't know if that answers it, but I'll let Justin answer the Vacaville one.
And for Vacaville, it's a similar process. There's a city adopted general plan by the city council for approved development. A lot of that development is the east of Leisure area going up towards the I-80 corridor. So there isn't any, I think it was active to stop development. There is a plan in place for development approval that includes those areas just east of Leisure Road.
Thanks, Justin. Great. All right. I'm going to turn to another question from Rich. Rich asks, when might we start doing something in the realm of projects and management actions? It's a great question. He suggests that time's a wasted and there's water that could be banked in our aquifer. And so wants to ask what projects and management actions are being started. And I think he also wants to know a little bit more about when. So, Justin, you're already on screen. Do you want to just mention, I know you covered it a little bit, but yeah.
And I think for the Vacaville GSA, getting the GSP submitted, the groundwater sustainability plan submitted to the state was a big lift. And then recognizing what projects or management actions that we can do going forward. And that's where recycled water is a tie-in for us. We've started the preliminary planning process. We've identified customers or potential customers. So that project is ongoing. I mean, it's going to take a while. It's not something that happens overnight. We've also started looking at groundwater recharge through stormwater. So if we build new detention basins, is there a nexus for, groundwater storage or recovery through those? So I would say that a lot of stuff is being started, but it's going to take some time to get those projects implemented. And again, a lot of this comes down to funding, as this was kind of an unfunded mandate by the state.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I will invite anybody else to add anything. Before I do that, I also want to invite Lupe to put in the chat. I know she already shared a link to the annual report. And Justin just spoke to kind of one of the many projects and management actions that the groundwater sustainability agencies have been thinking about. I do want to mention that in the annual report itself, table 7.1 actually lists a number of potential projects and management actions that were identified. And I think just want to note that should the funding come in for those, I think that's a really good list for people to reference. Nick, Vicky, Chris, anything you want to add to what I just said or what Justin shared with us?
Well, I guess I would just note that the grant application to DWR that Chris spoke of and others have alluded to, that there's a preliminary draft recommendation that the basin would receive that grant. It does include considerable support for those those advancing those projects and management actions that I think Rich is asking about. And so the hope would be with that funding in place, if it is in fact awarded, that we would be able to start really working at a greater level on those.
Great, thanks.
I have one other thing to add, Jen. There's also just recently coordination with Sustainable Conservation, and they are working as a contractor through Department of Water Resources, and their interests in exploring the value of recharge along the floodplain. And so, actively engaged with property owner Herb Wimmer and all of the monitoring that's gone on in his property. And then that plan from Sustainable Conservation was due back to DWR today. And so there's the possibility of looking at a whole host of different things, within the subbasin to try and augment, recharge where it's possible.
Great, thanks, Vicki. Great. I'm going to turn to a couple more questions that we have in the queue, and then I will a couple questions. I think, Vicki, what you just spoke to, and this question in particular gets at how can people continue to be active and become more active. And so we are going to be sharing a form where we will be asking for ideas like this and whether folks want to stay engaged. So stay tuned on that. We'll come to that in about 5 minutes. But before we do, I want to get to as many of the questions that are in the queue as we can. Kathy asks, why are we closing the Siskiyou Dam? I'm not sure if she's referring to the dam in Siskiyou County, but she also asked, can we build more dams and reservoirs to store water during drought years? Who'd like to take that on? Vicki, do you want to speak maybe just to the California perspective there and what you're seeing in the state? I recognize that this is not an answer, from a GSA. But it sounds like she's asking about the state building more dams and reservoirs.
I think just broadly, the state is looking at possibilities of, reoperation of current infrastructure, other infrastructure that would be beneficial, to plan ahead for extended drought conditions and trying to deal with the variability of the climate extremes, whether it's drought or flood, and the recent governor's orders in the last few months trying to encourage recharge and to make it a more flexible process to try and get water in the ground. So I think the Department of Water Resources is doing a lot to look at how does the whole state become more resilient, to weather, extremes in the future.
Great. Okay. I'm going to mention there's a few things coming here. I want to make sure that these voices get entered in the room. First, an anonymous person writes, shouldn't growth reduction be looked at as a part of the GSP? I think that question was answered with the discussion of the general plan. I'll note that person comments that they don't think that's an answer. There is a question from Shaylee. She asks, this is a done deal. I think she's referring to the fees. She writes, we will be monitored on what we use from our own wells. And we will be paying for water even if we did not sign up for the previous water districts out of the English Hills. She notes that this angers her. I just want to make sure that that comes in the room. I'm not sure if anybody wants to speak to either of those comments.
Maybe I'll touch on it a little bit, Jen. Yeah, it's unfortunate. You know, several of us have said this is all coming to us at the local level, unfunded from the state. Really what we're trying to do is protect this resource to make sure it's available here, as has been mentioned by several. Protecting our agricultural communities within the county is a very high priority. Providing drinking water for our citizens in the cities is a very high priority. And to do that, we need to make sure that we are meeting all the mandates that the state sends our way. And this groundwater sustainability plan is one of those ways that we maintain local control. It's unfortunate that we do have to pay for it here locally, and that's coming to many landowners, all landowners really. And it's something that we unfortunately are, we're trying to work on, trying to make it a little softer below, and we're going to try to get there. But it is something we have to do, because if the state did come in, they would be recouping their costs as well, and very likely making you do a little bit more. So we're hoping to stay away from that, trying to maintain local control, trying to protect that resource so that it is available for all of our future generations moving forward.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. So I want to invite, I think, Chris, that it spoke to a few of the questions in the queue. I want to invite, does anybody else from the panel want to add anything on either something they forgot to mention in their presentation or hearing some of the questions you've just heard? Anything else anyone wants to add? Great. Well, I really want to just appreciate, we had, over 20 questions come in. I think we answered almost all of them, and I really do appreciate the time of panelists staying late this evening and the time of all of you. And so with that in mind, I'm going to invite the slides to come back up, because we do want to talk a little bit about next steps, which we'll touch on a few of the last questions that might have come up. So I'm going to pass it over to Susanna Sossman from Ag Innovations. And Susanna will be sharing a little bit more about ways to stay engaged, including a feedback form where we really want to hear, did we answer your questions today? I also, while Susanna is talking, I want to acknowledge that there were a few questions specifically about some of the hydrology that we did answer via typing in some answers. And so I want to encourage folks to look at those typed answers. There was a great question about interaction between Yolo and Solano Subbasin and water there. So just want to encourage you to, while you're still on the call, to take a look at those answers that have been typed in. And Susanna, I'll pass the mic over to you to talk about ongoing community engagement and outreach.
Thanks, Jen. Really appreciate it. And also really appreciate, as Jen said, all of you for your engagement, your interest, your questions. This is for the subbasin and for all of you that we do this work. And so I am putting the slide back up that Chris showed earlier tonight of the long-term timeline. And that's really to remind us again that this is a really long-term process in order to maintain sustainability in the Solano Subbasin. And we mean it when we say that engagement is critical throughout implementation. And so all those great questions that you asked tonight, we want you to stay engaged. And I'd like to share a few ways for how you can do that. This is a list of some of those ways to stay involved. And we heard from the resource conservation districts tonight, from Dixon, RCD, and also the One Water Initiative. There are many great organizations doing work within the subbasin, and you can get involved with those organizations. Also, the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, GSA board meetings are a good way to stay connected to your own individual GSA. And then also signing up for the newsletter at the website, solanogsp.com. And I will mention a few of the other things that are on that website. There's a lot of resources there. including the groundwater sustainability plan that was submitted last year, as well as the annual report from this year and last year. There's also a map of the groundwater sustainability agencies in the subbasin, which you can look up based on your location. And we also post all of the previous meeting notes with the GSAs and town halls like this. We post the notes and the recordings there. So this town hall, we will post the summary there as well as the recording. And as Jen said, this is also a great opportunity to get your input. So I'd like to invite Lupe to put a link in the chat that will take you to a short feedback form. And we really do look at this feedback and appreciate it. It helps us shape our future outreach along this process. And I know that you're all busy, and so I ask you to go ahead and open the link in the chat now to offer your input. We'll just wait for a couple minutes and quiet so that you can do that now. And if you have any technical issues, you can chat Lupe for support. Thank you, everyone. So you're welcome to keep filling that out after the event. And finally, I just wanted to thank those who presented tonight and also those who are working on implementation throughout the subbasin, as well as all of you for attending and for your engagement and your interest. And we look forward to staying in touch with you.